13 brutal facts about traveling the Old West in a covered wagon. Welcome back to Past Not Past, where forgotten stories come alive. Today, we're hitching a ride on a covered wagon straight into the heart of the American frontier. Sure, you might remember the Oregon Trail game, or those classic westerns with sun-drenched plains and noble pioneers, but behind the romance lies a grittier truth. Life on the trail was no joyride. It was raw, relentless, and often heartbreaking. So before we let nostalgia take the reins, let's uncover 13 brutal realities of life on the trail. What did it truly cost to chase the American dream out west? Let's find out together. Months of misery. The first harsh truth, and perhaps the foundation for all other difficulties, was the terrifyingly long travel time. This wasn't a trip, it was a sentence. Even on the best days, a covered wagon might crawl about 20 miles. More often, they bled miles from the calendar, managing only 8 to 20 per day. The result, a trip from St. Louis to the West Coast, often took about 6 months. This wasn't travel. It was a relentless assault on the human spirit, a 6-month crucible that would break the weak and scar the strong. People got sick, got injured, and were sometimes buried in shallow graves thousands of miles from home. Reaching the West Coast was an extraordinary achievement, a testament to the sheer will to survive. They paid a very high price in time and hardship just to have a chance to start a new life. 6 months living in a state of near existence, not life. Really hard to imagine, isn't it? Your home was a bone-jarring box. Now, let's talk about their mode of transportation, the covered wagon. Forget romantic images. This was a torture box on wheels. The most iconic type was the prairie schooner. The Conestoga was larger, but too cumbersome for the treacherous journey. Regardless of the type, travel was a physical ordeal. These wagons had absolutely no suspension system. The wheels and axles were rigid wood. Every rock, every rut sent a violent shockwave directly through the wagon bed. Passengers weren't just tossed around. They were brutalized hour after hour, day after day. It felt like being trapped in a wooden box, being violently shaken by an unseen giant with no end in sight. To escape the torment, many chose to walk, trading the brutal ride for the crushing exhaustion of trekking thousands of miles on foot. It was a choice between two hells. Sitting was misery. Walking was misery. There were no comfortable options. No room at the inn or the wagon. The idea of a family nestled cozily inside their wagon at night is a comforting lie. Those prairie schooners were packed to the brim, with every worldly possession crammed into a space only about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. There was no room for human bodies, so most nights, families were cast out into the wilderness. They slept on the hard, unforgiving ground with only a thin blanket between them and the elements. They were utterly exposed to the scorching sun, the freezing nights, the sudden violent storms. If the weather turned truly nasty, their only refuge was to crawl under the wagon, sleeping on cold, damp dirt. Waking up sore wasn't a possibility. It was a guarantee. Every dawn was a resurrection from a night spent feeling vulnerable and unprotected. Trail cuisine and an unexpected fuel source. On the trail, you couldn't stop at a grocery store. Survival depended on the chuck wagon, the mobile kitchen of the wagon train. It carried water, coffee, and basic provisions. Below it, in the possum belly, was storage for fuel. But on the vast, treeless prairies, wood was a fantasy. The real fuel was dried cow dung or cow chips. Pioneers would spend hours gathering these, a humbling but necessary task, to cook a simple meal. Each evening, the chuck wagon became the heart of the camp. As cooks prepared meager meals of beans, bacon, and biscuits, families would huddle together. It was a brief, welcome moment of community in a world of isolation and hardship. Sitting down, eating a hot meal, however simple after a grueling day, must have been incredibly precious. Mules and oxen, not horses. The image of the pioneer on a noble steed is pure Hollywood. For most families, a horse was an impossible luxury. They were expensive to buy, and even more expensive to feed. Instead, the true heroes of westward expansion were the humble, stubborn mules and oxen. These beasts were practical marvels. They could survive on the rough forage along the trail, were immensely strong, and possessed a durability that horses lacked. Mules were sure-footed in the treacherous mountains. Oxen were relentless powerhouses on the flat plains. These quiet, unglamorous work animals were the engines pulling a new civilization west, their plodding footsteps the drumbeat of manifest destiny. The canvas cover was little protection. You'd think that canvas cover offered some sanctuary. You'd be wrong. Initially, the canvas wasn't even waterproof. Settlers had to painstakingly coat it with linseed oil. But even then, it was a flimsy shield against nature's fury. Wind was the constant enemy. It rarely rained straight down. Instead, storms came in sideways, driving rain and dust under the cover and into every crevice of their lives. The feeling of grit in your eyes, your mouth, your food was a constant, maddening reality. Settlers used a drawstring to cinch the cover tight, turning the wagon into a stuffy, dark cave. It was a desperate, often futile attempt to keep the brutal outside world from invading their tiny, fragile space. Breakdown miles from anywhere. Picture this: a splintering crack of wood, a sickening lurch, and then silence. You are hundreds of miles from anything resembling civilization. There are no repair shops, no tow trucks. There is only you, your broken wagon, and a vast, indifferent wilderness. This was the ever-present nightmare of the trail. The rugged paths were designed to destroy wagons. Wheels, shattered axles snapped. Pioneers were their own mechanics, forced to make repairs with basic tools and sheer ingenuity. A sturdy tree branch might become a temporary axle. A piece of animal hide could bind a split wheel. But a breakdown was a catastrophe. It halted the entire train, forcing families to unload all their possessions under the harsh sun while facing the constant threat of the elements. The pressure was immense. Fix it or be left behind to die. Treacherous river crossings. Sooner or later, the trail would end abruptly at the edge of a churning, muddy river, an impassable barrier of nature's fury. Ferries were rare and expensive. The only option was to ford it. It was a moment of sheer terror. Pioneers would try to waterproof their wagons, sealing cracks with wax, turning their homes into makeshift, highly unstable boats. Then came the plunge. The wagon would lurch into the violent current with oxen straining and men shouting against the roar of the water. Every second was an eternity suspended between survival and watery oblivion, as families watched their entire world risk being swept away. A successful crossing wasn't just a relief. It was a resurrection, a narrow escape from a watery grave where so many others had perished. The real killer's disease and accidents. How dangerous was the trail? The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that up to 10% of all pioneers died, translating to tens of thousands of deaths. But the greatest danger wasn't what you'd think. It was accidents, and above all, disease. Pioneer diaries are filled with grim accounts: accidental gunshots, children falling under the wagons, crushing wheels, death from exposure. But the most terrifying enemy was the one they couldn't see, the one that crept into camp silently. Sanitation was non-existent. Water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste. Cholera was the king of killers, a swift and brutal disease that could wipe out entire families in days. Diphtheria, typhoid, measles. These were phantoms that stalked the wagon train, turning a simple cough into a death sentence. This invisible killer cast the longest, darkest shadow over the trail. The truth about Native American encounters. Western movies have painted a picture of constant warfare. The reality was far more complex. During the peak years of migration, conflict was surprisingly rare. Historian John Unruh found that fewer than 400 pioneers were killed by Native Americans between 1840 and 1860. Compare that to the tens of thousands who succumbed to disease. Often, interactions were peaceful, involving trade or assistance. The famous circling of the wagons was done primarily to corral livestock, not to fend off an imminent attack. Sadly, when violence did occur, it was often instigated by the settlers themselves through arrogance or aggression. As westward expansion intensified after the 1850s, so did the conflict as Native Americans fought back against the tide of invaders encroaching on their lands. Arrival was not always the end of hardship. Imagine it, 6 months of hell, and you finally see your destination. The wave of relief must have been titanic. But for many, this was a hollow victory. The final brutal truth is that arrival was often just the beginning of a new struggle. Many pioneers staggered into their new lives as ghosts of their former selves, starving, sick, and destitute, having lost everything along the way. The dream they had suffered for seemed to mock them from a distance. Fortunately, a spirit of community often prevailed. Earlier settlers would organize relief parties, meeting the newcomers with food and supplies. This act of compassion was often the only thing standing between these exhausted travelers and death, a final touching testament to the shared ordeal of the trail. Why they pushed on motivation and consequences. After hearing these horrors, the question screams, why? The answer was a dream of a better life, of owning land, of escaping poverty. This powerful hope fueled their incredible determination. However, this story of resilience has a dark side. The westward expansion they championed led to the displacement and devastation of Native American tribes, a tragic consequence that cannot be ignored. This era was driven by manifest destiny, the belief in a divinely ordained right to expand. The pioneers, in their covered wagons, were the instruments of that belief. Their journey was one of incredible sacrifice and labor, but it was also one of conquest and loss for another people, the trail's enduring legacy. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 18 signaled the end of the Great Wagon Train era. But the trail's ghost remains. You can still see its scars on the American landscape, deep ruts carved into the earth by thousands of wheels. At places like Independence Rock, you can read the names of travelers carved into the stone, faint messages from a brutal past. These preserved sites, now part of the Oregon National Historic Trail, allow us to connect with this history. and the trail lives on in popular culture, most famously in the Oregon Trail video game, which introduced generations to the hardships of the journey. The trail continues to capture our imagination, a powerful symbol of the courage, desperation, and complexity of the pioneers who forged a new life in the West. How do you feel after hearing these facts? What surprised you the most? Or if you ever played the Oregon Trail game, what from the game do you remember most? And how does it compare or contrast with the reality we just explored? Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. As always, thank you all very, very much for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next video.